Hello, so my name is Colin Hartnett. I'm a student at the University of Maryland studying environmental science and policy. And this past summer, I was able to work with Howard EcoWorks as an intern on some projects regarding carbon accounting and biochar, alongside my coworker Abel Beyene. Slide. So just quickly to go over the outline of what we're going to be talking about. First, we're going to just give an introduction to the project and tasks associated with the internship. Then we'll go over a little bit of carbon accounting and what we did with that. Next, we'll talk about compost and biochar application to these BMP projects. After that, we'll start to go over biochar a little bit, including, so what is biochar? What are the properties of biochar? How is biochar produced? And then after that, we'll discuss the carbon sequestration potential of biochar. Then we'll go over the experiment that we did this summer for biochar, and then we'll talk about the goals related to that experiment. And lastly, we will go over some acknowledgements. All right, so briefly just go over the internship tasks. One of the main tasks was carbon accounting. And so that was essentially just determining the carbon footprint of the company and also the carbon offsets associated with company projects. And so those include BMPs, which could be rain gardens, tree plantings, bioretention systems, and more. Another task was to do biochar research and perform an experiment. So that involved creating and researching efficiencies of biochar, and then determining the potential impact of biochar on company projects in the future. And then lastly, we were tasked with disseminating this research and findings, whether that be through blog posts, analyzing the experimental results, or consulting with clients about the findings. Slide. Okay, so we were able to determine that EcoWorks emits roughly 54.5 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent annually. So to break that down a little bit, driving a vehicle is not owned by EcoWorks, and that includes commuting and site-to-site travel with employee-owned vehicles, accounted for a total of 38.528 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent a year. So that's the large majority of it. Electricity accounted for a total of almost 8 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent a year. And then driving with company-owned vehicles accounted for a total of a little over 8 tons a year. So as you can see, employee commuting and site-to-site travel made up for the large majority of Howard EcoWorks emissions. In regards to electricity usage, EcoWorks did fairly well, and we believe that they use roughly 23% less electricity than a standard commercial building of the same size. Slide. Okay, so just to talk a little bit more about carbon accounting. So we work to quantify EcoWorks' carbon footprint in regards to best management practices. And so in this case, the best management practices that we're discussing are rain gardens, conservation landscapes, tree plantings, and bioretention systems. So essentially, we determined how much carbon was either sequestered or emitted by these BMPs, and then we used that info to see how much these projects offset EcoWorks emissions. And so some of the factors that we would look at when determining this included transportation, what vegetation was planted there, the materials that were used to construct it, and the potential biochar and compost usage. Slide. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we came to these conclusions and also the significance of them. So for rain gardens, we were able to utilize an equation derived from a recent study, and that equation calculated both the 30-year carbon footprint and the 30-year carbon sequestration per 1 square meter of rain garden. And after going through this study, we felt as though the variables used to create this equation were very compatible with the characteristics of EcoWorks rain gardens. For conservation landscapes, we used an array of studies to determine the amount of carbon sequestered by perennials, by shrubs, and trees. And we used past projects to determine the ratios at which these types of vegetation were planted. For tree planting, we use some widely available calculations that can determine the amount of carbon sequestered given the DBH of the tree. And so the DBH is also known as the diameter at breast height. And so with this, we took into account every species of tree, every species growth rates, and also the maximum size that these species can reach. And as we also did with conservation landscapes, we imposed a standard 80% survival rate for the trees. And that's just to account for the fact that not all trees will make it to full growth. So within the same study, we were also able to use some equations to calculate rain garden, or to calculate bioretention system sequestration. And so if you look at the chart, you can see that bioretentions were one of the BMPs that did not appear to sequester carbon when compared to the carbon footprint involved with creating them. And so reasons why bioretention systems showed to have a large carbon footprint mainly just include the relatively large amount of material that is required to build them and the production and transportation of this material. According to the study that we used for the most part, they were quoted as saying, "This system requires a large amount of material such as concrete, pipes, and filter media, which can account for approximately 50% of the carbon footprint." And despite this, we still highly recommend the use of this BMP due to its positive environmental effects, and it has proven to be very effective. So part of the reason as to why we have the data on both a yearly and a 30-year scale is because these BMPs sequester carbon at varying rates. And as previously mentioned, some of the data that we utilized was based on a 30-year timescale to account for that. So we felt as if the best representation was to show it as a yearly one and as a 30-year one. So if we look at the values, we can see that tree plantings appear to be one of the most effective ways to sequester carbon. And that's very important to take into consideration. But one thing to also consider is that does not necessarily, tree plantings don't necessarily provide all of the benefits that conservation landscapes, tree plantings, and bioretention systems may. So one of the main focal points of Howard EcoWorks' mission is to reduce stormwater runoff in the area. And these other BMPs are extremely effective at doing that. And they also provide habitat for certain species, and they provide a diverse selection of vegetation that can be helpful for supporting other processes, such as pollination. So overall, you can see that, as we previously said, without offsets, yearly EcoWorks emits about 54.5 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And then when you add up the offsets on a yearly basis, that value is taken down to 35.7 tons, which is a fairly significant amount and would definitely place EcoWorks on the lower end of emitting companies. And then if you look at the 30-year data, you can see that there's a pretty drastic difference between the emissions without offsets and the emissions with offsets when you're looking at a timescale that large. Slide. So one other service of Howard EcoWorks is forest restoration. And this is when EcoWorks goes into a plot of forest and performs a variety of tasks, including invasive species removal and occasionally tree and bush plantings. So the overall goal is to restore the plot of forest to a state at which the vegetation is composed of only native species, and that the overall health of the forest is just maintained and preserved. So we did attempt to determine how much this was sequestering, but we did have a little bit of trouble calculating the amount of carbon sequestered by these practices. And we found that's because there's surprisingly little research done on addressing the long-term consequences of invasive species on carbon sequestration. Despite this, we do believe that this practice helps preserve stored carbon in the long term. So for example, if you just think about the process, if a forest is overrun with invasive vines and woody species, the overall biomass of the plot, and therefore the carbon content stored within that plot, it may not change too much in the short term, and it could theoretically increase for a few years as both species sort of coexist, not well, but they are still both present. But if these species are left unmanaged, they would eventually kill the native species. And then that would certainly decrease the amount of carbon sequestered in the plot, because as these natives are no longer to get sunlight, they're eventually going to die, they're going to fall and gradually decompose. So by removing invasive species now, EcoWorks is helping to protect these crucial carbon stocks that are found in the form of forests. Slide. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about compost and biochar application. So this chart shows the potential amount of carbon dioxide equivalent that would be sequestered if every BMP was amended with biochar and compost. And so that's assuming the soil is tilled and broken up, and then a certain amount of biochar compost mix, being a 50-50 mix, was amended with that soil. So biochar and compost, they both sequester carbon to different extents. So there were many variables that we had to take into consideration. So for biochar, some of the things that we looked at for this included the amount of carbon contained within 1 kilogram of biochar. And biochar has been shown to be roughly 80% carbon by mass. So if you have 1 kilogram of biochar, theoretically, you're going to have zero 0.8 kilograms of carbon within that. So for compost, we were able to utilize a few studies and determine how much would be sequestered and also the amount of emissions that would be prevented by composting, as opposed to just the standard landfilling process. And just a little bit more into that. So it was found that roughly twice as much carbon dioxide equivalent is emitted from landfilling than it is from composting. So that alone is definitely a good sign that that should be used. And then if we're going to look at the chart now, obviously on the left, we have the type of BMPs. Next to that, we have the amended area of the BMPs. And so that was a little bit different for all of them. For rain gardens and bioretention systems, through talking with people who have helped to install these, we determined that about 95% of the area could potentially be amended with this mix. For conservation landscapes, we assume that close to 100% of the area could be amended. Obviously, this would not really include root balls, but the large majority would be. For tree plantings, they do not till the whole area. So we had to determine the recommended size for a root ball, or the size of the hole for root ball that would be dug, and then the size of the root ball going into that, and then what would be left over that could be amended. And so that we found that to be about 2.405 square feet for one tree. And so that's why that value is a lot lower than the other ones. But then we go and look at the cumulative amended area of the BMPs. And so we determined that by figuring out essentially just how many projects were done, what the average size of each project was, and then adding that to the amended area for one project, or per square foot, I'm sorry. And then using the values that I talked about a little before with how much carbon was sequestered by biochar and how much carbon was sequestered by charcoal, we were able to determine how much per every project of each BMP could be sequestered. Slide. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about what biochar is and how it's made. So biochar is very similar to charcoal. It's produced by heating biomass at a very high temperature in an anaerobic condition called pyrolysis. And so that is just in the absence of oxygen. And so if you look at the diagram on the left, you can see the biomass particle to begin with. As you begin to heat it up, the water vapor is going to begin to evaporate. And then after that, you'll begin to see some volatiles evaporating. And so that's going to include a little bit more water, hydrogen gas, some oxygen, a little bit of carbon dioxide. And then if you see the darker colored particle, the third one, that is biochar. So that is when you would want to stop the burning process, when all that remains is carbon. And if you do continue to heat it after that, you are going to sort of just create an ash, and that will not provide the same benefits that biochar will provide. Now, if you look at the image on the right, that is what we would call the ring of fire biochar kiln. And so that is what we used in our experiment to create biochars. It's one of the best ways to manipulate, to create a anaerobic condition when you don't have the sort of same facilities that, for say, like a manufacturing plant would have for biochar production. And so the wood is stacked up, the fire is burnt is lit from the top down, and there's air on the side that helps contain it. Slide. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about biochar properties. So theoretically, biochar is a pure residual carbon if made correctly. It is highly absorbent, it's highly conductive, and it is extremely porous. So it's effective at a lot of things, and that's one of the reasons why it's gaining a lot of interest. For water retainment, due to the fact that biochar is extremely porous, it is able to retain water in these pores, which can both reduce runoff, it can also store water, and that can also sort of minimize the need for irrigation for crops if you're maintaining this moisture in the soil. The porosity of biochar also proves to be really helpful at nutrient retainment. So these pores can essentially trap excess nutrients and keep them retained in the soil where they can then be uptaken by plants at a later time. And so this can be helpful at trapping nitrogen and phosphorus that would otherwise be washed away by stormwater runoff as well. So for heavy metal absorption, the negative charge of biochar can attract positive ions, which can include lead, chromium, cadmium, arsenic, mercury, many others, and it just sort of acts as a means of pollutant removal, which can be very important. And lastly, the structure and characteristics of biochar contribute to an environment that is very suitable for microorganisms, and that is going to contribute to plant health as well. It's also important to note, I know we've talked a lot about the compost biochar mix. Well, the reason for that is biochar is often amended with compost before it is put into the soil. And what that does is it really soaks the pores so that when it is put into the soil, the biochar is already sort of charged and filled with nutrients. It does not suck up pre-existing nutrients there. Slide. So this is probably one of the reasons that biochar has been gaining so much popularity as of recently, is that it is potentially a really good means of sequestering carbon. So it is considered to be a carbon negative technology. And this is because it's taking a carbon neutral process of organic decay and it's making it carbon negative. So when you have vegetation, they're going to take in carbon dioxide and they're going to store that. And when they die, they're slowly going to decompose and release that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. But by sort of disrupting this process before these things can decompose, if you subject them to pyrolysis, it's going to convert these dead plants to a stable black carbon. And that can potentially, as studies say, last for thousands of years, up to 1,000 years in the soil. And just to put that into perspective a little bit, the potential for biochar, there was a study done by Queen's University in Ontario. And this study found that burning and burying 10% of the world's biomass waste would sequester 5 gigatons of carbon annually. And to put that a little more into perspective, 5 gigatons is more than the net 4.1 gigatons that human activity adds to the atmosphere each year. So it's just showing promise that this process could prove to be useful in the fight against climate change. Slide. Okay, so now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the biochar experiment and what went into that. Slide. Okay, so the main objective of this experiment was to examine the efficiency of biochar made from different species and practices, and then hopefully apply that info to EcoWorks projects. And so this is going to include creating biochar made from different feedstocks. It's going to include developing plots at Howard County Community College and sending these things to a lab where they can determine efficiencies, and then hopefully apply these findings to the carbon footprint projects. And then lastly, disseminate the findings to the general public and clients and potentially incorporate them into future EcoWorks projects. Slide. Okay, so the first step of this experiment was to make our own biochars from 4 different species. The first species was ash. It is the only one of the 4 species that was native. It was once extremely common in the region, and while its presence is certainly still noticeable, most of the ash trees in the area have died. And that is a result of the emerald ash borer bug. As these insects larvae, they tunnel under the bark and they feed on the part of the tree that is responsible for like moving water and sugars. Next, we had the Paulownia tree, and that is an invasive species from China, and it's more commonly called the empress tree or the princess tree, if you've heard of it as that. Next, we had the Chinese privet. That was another invasive species, and that has spread rapidly in the area. It's extremely competitive. It outcompetes the native species fairly easily. And lastly, we had the autumn olive. And autumn olive is one of the most common invasive species in the eastern United States. So this species is extremely hardy and it can wreak havoc on entire native ecosystems. Slide. So here we just have a few images kind of showing the process of how we created the biochar. First, we would collect feedstock from each invasive species and we would chop that up. We would bring it to the kiln where we would stack it up to the top, and then we would light it from the top to the bottom. And so once we felt as though the biochar was at a good stage and hadn't reached an ashy stage yet, we would put it out, we would hose it down with water, cool it off, and then we would collect each sample, each species in a different bag, and we would measure the yields for that too. Slide. Okay, so what were the next steps after that? So samples of the kiln-produced biochar were then sent to a lab, and they analyzed a few different things. So they checked out the carbon content, the surface area, the particle size distribution, internal porosity, and some other factors that are typically measured for commercial biochar products. And so these factors could help determine which kiln-produced biochar would be the most effective. So while we awaited these results, test plots were developed at Howard Community College, and the soil at each of the plots was amended with either kiln-produced ash biochar or privet biochar. And then there was another plot with commercially produced biochar, and one plot with no biochar, which was the control plot. So after that, seedlings were planted in each of the plots, and we waited for these to become fully established. Ash and privet, just to note, they were utilized for two reasons. One is that they showed to have less ash than the autumn olive and paulownia biochar that we produced. And the other reason being that they were the most abundant. So it worked out for us in that way. Once the plots were settled and the vegetation had sufficiently grown, samples were sent to a lab in which they measured stormwater runoff. And they did this through something called saturated hydraulic conductivity. So this data could then be used, or was used, to estimate the pollutant removal efficiencies of each plot. And this lab also measured the plant health via an imaging analysis of the plant root structure. So with this information, they could determine which plot was the most effective at nutrient and pollutant removal, and which plot yielded the healthiest vegetation. And therefore, you can reach a conclusion on whether kiln produced, commercially produced, or no biochar, which is very unlikely, is the most effective practice for EcoWorks projects. And so while this experiment is complete, the interpretation of the results is still underway, but we're really excited to see what they show. Slide. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about EcoWorks goals with this. So why were we doing this project? One of the main goals is just to determine the most efficient biochar application and trying to see which type of biochar we should be using in future projects, whether that be kiln-produced biochar that we can make in a backyard, or commercially produced biochar that is manufactured on a large scale, or what, like I said earlier, possibly none, which is highly unlikely. This project was done to give us a better understanding of the capabilities of the BMPs that EcoWorks has been installing in regards to carbon sequestration. And so as we saw, they do have significant effects on carbon sequestration, and that's a really positive outcome. So another thing was the invasive species removal for biochar production. So what we kind of came to the conclusion was that this was a potential for company expansion. And we know that a lot of EcoWorks work involves removing invasive species. So depending on the lab results, if we are able to find that invasives make for good biochar products, then that sort of leaves us with the potential to create a service in which EcoWorks makes biochar out of these invasive plants. And this biochar could then be sold to clients or used in future BMP construction projects on more of a local scale, which would be incredible. So, and then lastly, just overall, to better understand the carbon footprint of EcoWorks and their projects. And if you're able to better understand how the company is contributing to, per se, climate change, it gives you a better perspective on how to maybe alter things or make adjustments to minimize that. Slide. Okay, so that is the end of the presentation. There are many people that we would like to acknowledge, including our Lori Lilly, Ben Fertig, and many other people, especially the Ready crew. Couldn't have done the experiment without them. So thank you guys for listening. If you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments below, and we will do our best to get back to you as quickly as possible. Thank you.